packet pushers.
Welcome to the IPv6 Buzz, where we dare to dive into the 128-bit address space wormhole. I'm Ed Horley.
And I'm Scott Hoag. On the show, we discuss all things IPv6, strategy, design, deployment, and operations.
And I'm Tom Coffeen. We've spent 20 plus years working with the IPv6 protocol. We run a consulting firm where we get IPv6 working for our customers.
And we're here to share some lessons learned and how to avoid common mistakes. We're glad you joined us. Today, we're going to be talking about compressing the IPv6 deployment timeline, because that seems to be a big issue for a lot of folks in terms of trying to figure out what's going on and how much time it actually takes to get IPv6 deployed and operational. So the obvious question is, when's the right time to start, you guys? When's the right time to actually kick off and start figuring this out?
A decade ago. The second best time is now.
Yes. Now's good for me. How about you?
Yeah, we've been saying this for a long time. And those that are longtime listeners of the show probably already know this. But yeah, you should have already started. Not to state the obvious, but yeah, if you haven't started, now is a great time to go ahead and get going, because part of the challenge is there's a lot of moving parts that go along with deploying IPv6, especially if you're in a larger environment of any type, and you need to be able to sort of plan accordingly, right? And figure out what that impact is going to be, because part of the challenge with IPv6 is it really does touch everything inside of an enterprise or commercial network, and anything that connects to the network is going to have to deal with IPv6 in some capacity, right?
Yeah, you can just look at the IETF RFC 7381 Enterprise IPv6 Deployment Guidelines and say, oh, okay, here's the list of tasks generally accepted is what we're going to be doing. We're going to build a team, get organized, figure out how much addressing we need, right, Tom?
Yep.
We need to get trained, build a plan, build a design, do an assessment, where are we at, and then start on the internet edge, build it inward, build it out to the edges. It could take years for a large size organization to get it rolled out in a dual stack style.
Yeah. And then part of that assessment is really figuring out what devices can and can't support, and then figuring out how to sort of transition that over with other initiatives you have going on. Maybe it's a LAN upgrade or SD-WAN upgrade or security and firewall upgrade. And you want to make sure that you're sort of timing everything together and that the technology matches up so that you can be successful sort of getting the right environment set up the way it needs to. You may not be turning V6 on immediately, but at least you're prepared and ready to go. And hopefully maybe you've done some proof of concept testing just to validate that you can get it working that way, right?
Yeah. Each of these little tests we just laid out have a dependency. Getting your addresses is a dependency for everything.
Right.
And building out the IPv6 in through the internet edge and into the core of the network is a dependency for V6, enabling it at certain network edges for applications, hosts, IoT, cloud. So you have to have the core built out as a dependency before you light up IPv6 on edge networks, access networks in your data center or at a field site.
Yeah. And it's important to know that you're still going to have V4 operating. So you need to be thinking through all the transition technologies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to be able to test and validate that those transition technologies work in the way that you anticipate, that you can make them highly available in the way that you need to, and that they're going to operate in a way that you understand what's going on in your network is the other important aspect, right? Of actually knowing what's happening. So I think people may anticipate that just turning on dual stack becomes an easier solution, but there are times when you might have services that just can't turn on V6 for any given reason. You have to talk to them with V4, and you may want to take advantage of some of the transition capabilities to be able to move forward to maybe potentially do V6 only, right? As a long-term project plan. So you need to really test and validate all of that stuff going in.
I think there's also a huge risk related to just treating IPv6 in the same way that you're used to treating IPv4. And I guess that's where training kind of comes in. It would be great and ideal, obviously, if you're at an enterprise and you could get the full suite of training around IPv6, especially that's offered by certain companies that will go unnamed. But basically all of the ins and outs and grisly details of IPv6, it's not necessarily that you have to know that, but you do have to recognize the difference between IPv6 and IPv4 and not adopt some of the same operational models that use in IPv4. IPv4, and in particular, even just how you're handling the address space, because you can really sort of create some problems for yourself right at the outset if you're thinking about, well, how do I subnet this /64 because it's 18 quintillion addresses and there's no way I'm going to waste that many blah blah blah. We've talked that point to death in the past, but it's definitely a pitfall. So there's a sort of minimum amount of IPv6 knowledge to get past the IPv4 thinking component of things, so that you don't start off down the road and immediately hobble your efforts to adopt IPv6 by doing strange things that the protocol doesn't really support.
Yeah. If you lay out your addressing correctly, you should never have to readdress IPv6. But that would be the worst thing to do, is to jump in, not have a well thought out plan, deploy it, and then a year from now, readdress IPv6. I heard you liked readdressing, so we're going to make you readdress IPv6 too. That would be terrible.
Yeah. Maybe this gets back to the original point, which is, there's certain things that you shouldn't be compressing on your timeline. And as with all good projects, right, architecture and design is where you should be thinking more carefully through these things. But it often gets compressed, right, in terms of priority. And they're like, oh, we just scramble and get something done. And we got a week and a half. We can get it working. Right.
Yeah.
And I don't want to lie. There are absolutely use cases where, we've scrambled and gotten things working for customers, and that's that. And that's okay. And they understand the trade-off that occurred for that in order to solve a particular problem. And we just explain the caveats. And that's okay. That's all right. But maybe we talk a little bit about what the trade-offs really are, about kicking the can or about delaying or not doing the right amount of engineering work up front, because there are penalties you're going to pay. They're not obvious. Well, some of them are obvious. But, why don't we talk through a little bit about what those trade-offs look like for everyone?
Yeah. If you started your IPv6 plan and initiative 10 years ago, and you're aiming to have it done maybe by 3 years from now, you've given yourself a long runway. You could chip away at IPv6, hour a week, couple hours a month, slow and steady. It's just a little side project. It just goes along and kind of builds over time, and you've given yourself an extremely long runway. Let's say you started now, and IPv6 is continuing to grow globally on the internet, 5% a year. Doesn't seem like a lot. Doesn't seem like it's a very fast moving train that's approaching, that you have to jump off the tracks really fast. But if it took you 3 years to deploy it, well, now it's maybe not an hour a week, or it's maybe a day or two a week you're spending on it. And all IT departments have many other competing priorities, have for the past decades. And in the future, there will always be other initiatives. Oh, we have the flying car project. Oh, we have the robots project.
Man, I want to work there.
Yeah. So you're always going to have these projects that are going to compete. Well, IPv6 just needs to be part of the standard set of projects you're working on. But if you continue to not do it, you're just making life worse for yourself down the road, maybe.
Yeah, and you end up having to number your flying car with IPv4 squat space.
Yes, because you don't have enough. Yeah.
And I think there's a misconception in the industry overall, and then maybe I call out some vendors and some other folks that continue to drive the message that IPv6 doesn't have wide use. And this is just personal frustration of venting, so I apologize to the audience, but I've been sitting on calls now for the last year and listening to people say oh, well, the adoption rate is really poor, or the uptake rate is really poor. And I'm like, you have to put that in context. Maybe not in enterprise deployments are you seeing the sort of adoption that might be happening in other areas, but the reality is the world has moved into a world of IPv6. That's just fact. There's no questioning this. You can look at the published stats that are available. And I think there's a misconception that a lot of folks who haven't looked into it in the past decade or 5 years even don't realize how much IPv6 traffic really exists on the public internet today. And if you want to talk about having internet-driven services, if the word IPv6 doesn't come out of your mouth, you're really not on the internet anymore. And hopefully that's a fair statement, but it is very frustrating to hear both vendors and practitioners talk about how there's no IPv6.
Yeah, years ago, I did some post on LinkedIn about IPv6. Maybe it was talking about one of our articles or one of our podcasts. And someone put back in the comments, give it up. IPv6 is never going to happen. And I didn't have the heart to tell that person that the message they had just sent me on LinkedIn was on a IPv6 only server in a IPv6 enabled LinkedIn data center. I was like, yeah, I guess I'll just continue to let you believe that IPv6 isn't a thing. And you see posts on social media sites saying IPv6 isn't happening. And I'm like, did you use your mobile phone to post that?
Yeah, it's so funny because it's always interesting because there's a large gulf, I think, between sort of where service provider, mobile cellular providers, and home internet providers are at versus enterprises. And certainly the content providers are already all there, right? They realize that they have to provide services to where the eyeballs are, and the eyeballs are all on IPv6. That's just the reality of the world right now. But enterprises seem to think that they don't have to change or adopt to those given sets of technologies. It almost feels like, back in the day when we had all the sort of bring your own IT initiatives and stealth IT stuff going on, and enterprises refusing to acknowledge all of the technology stacks that their employees were bringing into the office or making use of, and basically bypassing all the controls that they were putting in place. It sort of feels like, V6 is surreptitiously doing the same thing in some ways because it doesn't fit in the category of something that the IT teams are bringing into the fold and figuring out what to do. They're kicking the can. They don't want to address it. They don't want to deal with it in their VPN scenarios or, their edge security scenarios, or got zero trust initiatives, and they're not putting V6 into the we should do something with category. They're saying like, well, we can just ignore that category. And they're really kicking the can down. I don't know. Does that fall in the category of like, is it willful ignorance or is it actually negligence at some point where you're not addressing that stuff? Because the reality is that this home user more than likely has V6 available, and you're trying to put security controls around them, but you're ignoring all their V6 related traffic. I don't know how that's secure. I don't know how that's winning in the end game there.
Right. You're the CISO at a big company, and you're like, I'm not going to create an IPv6 security plan because we're not doing IPv6. But that person fails to realize how much IPv6 is used on the internet by their employees on their mobile phones, when they're at home working remotely because of a pandemic, deployment of IPv6 by their business SaaS applications, and haven't created any type of a strategy. But, the enterprise did deploy IPv6. It's deployed on the internet, which is the new corporate WAN. So it's getting deployed, whether the enterprise acknowledges it or not. They could either choose to embrace it and secure it and move along with the rest of the world, or they could be in the laggards category.
Well, and there's real risk related to the fact that it's running internally and not managed in many cases. I mean, we've made that point several times on the show. That's something where you run the risk of negligence related to the security posture that for the IPv6 that's already running on the network, because the operating systems have it on by default and attempt to prefer it by default. And you may not have put any of the internal plumbing in for any of that to be used, but it doesn't mean that there's not a security profile risk associated with that.
Yeah. An end user has a problem when they're working, remotely across the internet, IPv6 enabled corporate WAN, and they call the help desk. Say, hey, I have a problem accessing this business application. I can't enter my timesheet for this week, or I can't access this HR database, or I can't get to my benefits or payroll or something. And they call the help desk, and the help desk can't help. They don't know about the protocol, and this increases the mean time to repair and causes end user experience problems and loss of productivity.
Yeah, and just to clarify earlier for what Tom had mentioned, that you might have heard Scott refer to that as sort of the inherent latent threat around IPv6, just to sort of glue those two concepts together there. But I think it's really important for everyone to realize, like, Google from their G Suite, and I think almost all of the services that Google provides is V6 enabled. Same thing is true with the mass majority of Microsoft services now publicly available online. And then all the cloud providers have V6 capabilities to be able to provide services. Whether they're available for every single service is something you have to look into, but the list is growing rapidly all the time in terms of what they're supporting, because they realize how important IPv6 is in terms of that transition. At least it feels like to me, momentum wise, that there's a threshold that we sort of crossed, not just domestically here in the US, but internationally around IPv6. When you look at the international related numbers to IPv6 adoption, where countries like India have greater than 70% adoption, and you look at the overall population of a country like India, you can't ignore what's going on, plus the initiatives that are going on within China, and then obviously with the US itself, within the federal government. There's going to be more and more V6 deployed over the coming years, and choosing to willfully ignore or not understand it is not to the benefit of your company, right? Like, it could potentially harm your business because your technology stack doesn't have the capabilities to support IPv6 because you didn't plan for, design, architect, or do all the due diligence to sort of do that work. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but that's sort of what it feels like right now. Is it feels like you're going to really harm your company if you don't have the right plan in place.
Yeah, I mean, countries around the world are deploying it. That's no secret. Countries have initiatives to move to IPv6 only. Countries like Czech Republic, China, Vietnam, Germany. There's a lot of countries moving that direction. And if you do business in those countries, with other entities in those countries, they're going to get pulled along with those, mandates, and the rest of the world is just going to transition and you're just going to be stuck. But then also you're maybe creating a situation for yourself where then you're going to have to deploy it at some late date and you may not have the ability to deploy it at your leisure.
Right.
It's going to be an emergency project at some point because there's some flow down requirement like, oh my God, our bank can't talk to this and we can't do something. And they're saying we have to have it. And oh my gosh, we need it done in 3 months.
Right. Well, that is one way to compress the timeline, Scott.
Yeah.
That's right.
I wish we had started a long time ago. Now this is an emergency, all hands on deck. Drop all other IT initiatives, which might be relevant to the business. Now you're in an emergency situation, and that's what you don't want to be in. In IT departments, we're always in IT firefight mode, and we'd like to not be in that for once.
I think it's important to recognize if you're chipping away at something like IPv6 from an overall adoption standpoint, you can do this over time and get incremental wins as you deploy IPv6 across your environment and really have a good understanding about what you're dealing with. Or you can take all your resources and do an IPv6 deployment in a very short sprint, but you're consuming all of their time and all their resources to make that happen, which, as you said, Scott, basically puts everything else up on the shelf. You can't do anything with those folks unless you either hire more people, hire consultants, whatever it needs to do to try and help keep everything moving forward.
And if they haven't mastered the fundamentals of IPv6, it could be catastrophic to try to compress the timeline under those circumstances.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah,
Yeah.
you are going to make mistakes when you're trying to do it that quickly and maybe don't know IPv6 to the extent that you maybe should if you had taken the time to learn it properly and sort of understand the nuances and be able to get out of the IPv4 mindset. I guarantee you, if you're trying to sprint and get this done in 3 months, you're going to take along all that technical debt that you take from IPv4, you're going to put it right into IPv6. Carry that rock up the hill yet again. Maybe a boulder.
Yeah. It's nice if IPv6 could just be a 5% project and consume that many resources over a long period of time. But imagine if you waited and then it became a 20% project. That's 20% of every person in the IT departments because IP touches everything in the IT universe. Everyone in the entire IT department is going to spend 20% of their time on IPv6. That's a lot.
Yeah. And I do hear the contrarians on calls and, when you're talking in general on some of the social media, they're just like, oh, I can just ignore this or, oh, I want to retire before any of this stuff goes on. And for those folks that fit in that category, please just don't at least stand in the way of those that actually want to get something done. If you don't want to work on it, totally understand. There's no reason to be negative and tamp it down for everyone else who's trying to move forward. I guess that's my polite ask.
Yeah. Just don't be no as a service.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's funny that you'll hear folks that talk about it and say, like, oh, I heard about this 20 years ago and, it's not a thing. Well, you were introduced to the protocol. You weren't introduced to an operational readiness state yet.
Yeah.
And I think the reality is that I think all of us probably agree to this, is that while IPv6 was under development and lots of folks were talking about it, the actual point that V6 was starting to gain traction was really around the launch date, which was 2012. And there's been slow incremental progress that's been happening from there around protocol development and around working out operational bugs and things of that nature. And then there's been a sort of a hockey stick of rapid acceleration. And one of the reasons I can say this very definitively is because of the amount of work that's currently going on in the ITF around IPv6. And it's important to point out there is no more development work going on around IPv4 in the ITF anymore. They don't even talk about it, right? There is no IPv4 work. There might be some small fixes or something else that goes on with that, but in terms of actual active development of the protocol, there is nothing else going on. It's only going on in IPv6. So do realize if you think things are progressing in that category, no, there's nothing progressing in the V4 category at all. And I think that's an important thing to recognize from a pure technology standpoint of someone who might be servicing in a higher end CTO, CIO, VP level position, and you're making strategic investments or bets. Do you bet on something that has no development going on it anymore?
That's a good point.
I just don't know if that's common knowledge for everyone to realize that that's actually the case, at least within the standards groups. So it's sort of like betting against Ethernet, but
Yeah. Token ring, baby.
FDDI all the way.
FDDI all the way. Scott and I are in the FDDI camp. So
Dual counter rotating rings, can't beat it.
yeah.
I get it. I get it.
I guess we'll have to apologize to the listening audience here about our session.
I think it was pretty mild by most standards.
Yes, about complaining about where things are at. Maybe we'll provide a few links in the show notes around the current status around IPv6 so that people cannot claim willful ignorance about not knowing about what's going on, that you can share this with them and say like, hey, this is where things are at. This is where the current status is. And maybe we need to pay a little bit more attention.
Yeah, it is frustrating when we hear about IPv6 projects that might be happening and then at the last minute they get canceled and superseded by another IT initiative. And you're like, man, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. You can start on it slow and steady. You don't have to completely ignore it, thinking in the future you're going to have time to work on it when you realistically you aren't going to have time in the future. So you just need to make time now, start sooner, give yourself more runway, don't compress the schedule. That's a more advantageous position to be in.
I completely agree. All right. Thanks all. Thanks for joining us for this episode of IPv6 Buzz. If you've got feedback or a follow-up on this topic, send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. We'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
Also, on packetpushers.net, you'll find a range of deep dive technical podcasts for IT pros, including heavy networking, heavy wireless, and day 2 cloud.
There's a whole lot more on the Packet Pushers site as well, such as tutorial videos and a networking job board to help you find or fill your next great role. So whether you're deep in your career or just starting up, Packet Pushers is the place to go to grow both your skills and your personal network.
So long and until next time, we'll see you on the IPv6 internet.